What is food, anyway? We were once single-celled organisms floating in the primal goop. For the longest time, this simple life survived on carbon compounds or by making energy from sunlight. When photosynthesis grew boring a couple billion years later, an amoeba decided to swallow some nearby algae, and just like that, food was born. It's gotten a bit more complex in recent years, but from that amoeba's first meal to your Sunday afternoon paella, it's just a few more leaps of logic and faith. As someone who has no idea how to grow rice or saffron or how to scour the bottom of the ocean for crustaceans, I take these things mostly on faith. The ingredients appear in the supermarket somehow, and I buy them. At home, I touch a button and the stove heats up. But sometimes I think, what are we even doing? How did food get so complicated? A bunch of mostly hairless primates creating vast logistical networks so we can eat lobster with a squeeze of lemon on our birthdays, flying pieces of meat around the world in metal tubes for consumption elsewhere. It's bizarre. On that note, I recently had an interesting meal that I wanted to talk about. A real foodie experience here in Barcelona. A month or so ago, a new guy from Australia came to the gym. Talking to him after class, I learned he was redoing a warehouse up the street. Redoing a warehouse isn't too unusual in Barcelona, with real estate as it is, but I asked some follow-up questions, and I found out that my new jiu-jitsu buddy Jack is a fancy chef starting a new project just up the street in Poblenou. 1 table, 6 people, and an elaborate tasting menu. Now, I'm the kind of guy who usually runs a mile when he hears the words tasting menu. But as you may know, I'm married to Morena, and Morena is a foodie. She talks about food, she knows the names of dozens of dishes and ingredients in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, languages she otherwise doesn't speak. She watches videos of old ladies making noodles, and has opinions about every type of chili paste in Asia. I'm the opposite. I can eat steak every day, and I would if it were cheaper. As it is, I sometimes meal prep chicken breasts for the whole week or buy salmon fillets in bulk for freezing. This isn't to say that I don't enjoy food. I do, but I think of it more as protein, fat, and carbs. Eating and cooking are maintenance tasks that happen to be enjoyable. In other words, I'm well-fed, but not a foodie. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 102, and it's about a Barcelona foodie experience at Table by Ona. First, I'd like to give a shout out to Deb. Deb heard my previous episode 100 actually, the episode about Spanish nationality. She says she's been listening for 2 years since she started learning Spanish. She enjoys the podcast and she contributed to my legal defense fund. Thank you, Deb, for your kind donation. If anyone else would like to donate, expatmadrid.com/donate is the place for that. I've got a donation page set up. You can donate anything from €3 to however much you want. I appreciate whatever you can send my way. I ended the Spanish nationality episode on a cliffhanger on purpose. We are going to appeal. My lawyer's writing up some arguments, I guess, about the whole thing. It's an interesting episode if you would like to check that out, episode 100. This episode is about a foodie experience here in Barcelona with my new jiu-jitsu buddy Jack. So let's get to it. Jack's project is called Table by Ona, and it's in the up-and-coming Poblenou neighborhood. I wrote about Poblenou, or I recorded a whole podcast about Poblenou recently. It is episode 85, it looks like. Poblenou neighborhood, Barcelona. Poblenou is one of Barcelona's up-and-coming areas. It's a former industrial neighborhood where hipsters now share specialty coffee, and the sight of new office buildings going up is becoming ever more common. The concept for Jack's project is as I described: 1 table, 6 people, and a long tasting menu. I signed up for their opening night, €90 per person, pay in advance, location undisclosed. Once you've spent some time doing jujitsu, sweaty and grunting with effort on top of another man, supporting his new business is something of a no-brainer. At jujitsu class a few days before the event, Jack describes the experience they're putting together as the American hipster's dream. Well then, I say, I'm the American hipster. He laughs. No, you're not. Then we roll around on the ground and try to choke each other for 6 minutes. So it is that at 9 p.m. last Friday, Morena and I arrived at a nondescript building in Poblano and walked up some stairs to Table by Ona. There's Ethiopian lounge music playing on vinyl, long candles dotted around the room for ambience. A lamp hung over the one table is made out of thick handmade paper. I made the table myself, says Jack. It's a piece of German oak we brought with us. He sits us down, and his partner Aniela, a fashion designer from Portland, Oregon, serves us drinks. Morena starts chatting with everyone, and so we begin. The first dish is a bit of fennel with some slices of a tiny lemon-like fruit swimming in white liquid. The yogurt, announces Jack, is an homage to ayran, the Turkish drink. Jack hovers over the next dish in the background, adding minute amounts of sauce with an eyedropper, looking like a heavily tattooed mad scientist in his lab. After that, there's a tuna tart and some white asparagus that's covered in an emulsion made of fat from the same tuna. There's a tiny skewer stuck through 2 pieces of glazed Iberian pork belly. It's all very good, but I've immediately realized that I'm not the target audience for things like this. Morena is in heaven, though, nerding out on the various exotic edibles. Oh my God, where did you get Buddha's hand? Buddha's hand is an oddly shaped, fingery citrus fruit. You can Google it. Growing up back in Arizona, we didn't have much food culture. There was no Turkish anything as far as I can recall. It was several miles from our house to the nearest supermarket. We did eat a lot of Mexican food, and as is common in former British colonies, when cooking we boiled our vegetables with nothing, cooked our beef till it was gray in the center, and found numerous other ways to ruin what must have been perfectly good food. I'm sure other kinds of Americans had fine culinary traditions that brought with them from the old country. Middle-class Anglo-Saxons like us ate bland mush and leathery meat for dinner. Often, bread with butter was the high point of the meal for me. A growing teenager, I'd eat whatever my mom had cooked, then have slice after slice of bread and butter until I was full. When the Safeway started selling freshly made baguettes sometime in the 90s, it was a huge revelation. In other words, we weren't foodies. I don't know if anybody was back then. Next, Jack brings out some veal tartare. Eventually, he says, we'd like to work closely with the farms so we can boil the veal in the milk of its own mother, which of course is totally not kosher. You probably wouldn't believe me if I told you how often I think of the biblical injunction not to boil a calf in its mother's milk. Mostly, I think, what kind of person would do such a thing? But I guess we've found one. Morena at this juncture would like to point out that I have enjoyed plenty of beef stroganoff in the past several years, and if we're splitting hairs, I suppose that browning pieces of beef in butter would also not be kosher. According to thetorah.com and other sites, there's quite a lot more to be said about boiling suckling calves. It's even possible that the whole thing is a big misunderstanding, and that Yahweh is actually fine with us mixing meat and dairy. Also, I'm not Jewish, so technically I shouldn't care at all. Next up, some beetroot that's been cooked in its own dirt. After cooking, the beets are peeled. Nobody's making you eat dirt at these things, but for a moment I wonder, what if the next big thing is kids eating bowls of dirt? Coming soon to a brunch spot near you. The conversation around the table is logically about food. Jack's off in the background blasting our next course with a blowtorch, which makes Morena think that she would like to own a culinary blowtorch of her own. But what would we use it for, I ask. Tons of things, she replies, as if the many culinary uses of a blowtorch were obvious. But in the end she can only think of lighting candles and of burning the sugar on top of creme brulee, so maybe she doesn't need one after all. Let's let grammar and spelling nerd Daniel interject for a moment here. Creme brulee has a descending accent over the first E in creme. It has a little triangular hat over the U in brulee, and there are two E's on the end of brulee. The first E at the end of brulee has an ascending accent. Just for your information, I'm sure that you were capable of pronouncing creme brulee without the different diacritical marks. But that's the official spelling. Now I know, and so do you. I'm sure the 1% of people out there who care about spelling and grammar in the same way that I do have appreciated this little aside. In any case, Morena decides that maybe she doesn't need a culinary blowtorch after all. My dad had a blowtorch when I was growing up, I say. It was for joining copper pipes. The courses keep coming. Here's a piece of mackerel with applesauce, accompanied by a slice of apple covered in mackerel sauce, made from the smoked heads of the same mackerel we're eating. Mackerel is funny, says Jack. I'd never tried it till I got to Spain. In Australia, we just use mackerel as bait to catch bigger fish. Indeed, I find this whole thing to be pretty hilarious, but for other reasons. My grandfather Henry was in New Guinea during World War II, building bridges and runways out in the jungle. Probably the last male of his line to have visible abs, he complained about the food out in the Pacific Theater. Mutton so full of worms that if you tried to pick the worms out, you'd be left without any mutton. Several men in his unit died of botulism. He lived, went back to the U.S., had a family. I inherited his giant ears. And 80 years later, here I am, eating a 2-square-inch piece of scorpion fish and living the 21st century foodie's dream in Barcelona, Spain. When I experience luxury these days, I often think of some of my ancestors who went their whole lives without any sort of luxury. Shout out to those guys. Thanks for everything. The final course is a couple of slices of duck breast with a layer of fat along the edge. I think this is a take on magret de pato, a popular thing around here in Catalonia that I never order. Jack's version, of course, is better than the one I had years ago because he's very good at all this. Back in Berlin, he says, we made 50 courses a day. Jack worked at Ernst in Berlin before moving to Barcelona. Apparently Ernst is or was a 9-seat counter restaurant that people would fly in from around the world to visit. The menu changed daily. It was all farm to table, etc. I guess the idea of this sort of place is to buy your seasonal produce in the morning, then sit down and decide how you're going to make it. Some of the ingredients for tonight were foraged up on Tibidabo, one of the mountains just outside Barcelona. I wonder what fancy chefs eat at home. Finally, we're almost done with our meal. There's a strange noise coming from behind a curtain. I just assumed Jax started washing the dishes, but one of the other guests, a chef herself, suggests he might be using a Paco jet. And he is. First, some sorbet as a palate cleanser. Morena claims it was made of grapefruit. My photographic memory for food seems to be failing me in this case. For dessert, we have ice cream made of duck eggs that's an homage to Ben & Jerry's. It's been spun in the Paco jet, a machine that spins ice cream at 2,000 RPM until it's light and fluffy. I wasn't aware that foods could be an homage to other foods, but I'm sure Ben & Jerry would be flattered. What kind of foodie are you? Food is a part of people's identity. Whether you're a broke college student eating packaged ramen noodles, or an OnlyFans girl in Dubai who eats nothing but gold leaf hamburgers, your food choices are a part of what makes you you. Culture tells people what to eat and how and when. Spain wouldn't be Spain without all its wonderful cuisine. But beyond the basic premise that Americans eat hamburgers and Spaniards eat tortilla de patatas, there are plenty of cultural do's and don'ts about food that we often just take to be basic facts. Is mackerel a food, or is it just a bait to catch better fish? Can we have noodles for breakfast, or should we reach for a bowl of cereal? Do we cook veal in milk or in olive oil, or do we reject veal entirely? Interesting questions. I also find it fascinating how some things go from basically garbage to expensive and hipsterish to totally mainstream when the only thing that's really changed is people's ideas about what's good to eat. I'm a man of simple tastes, a stoic, if you will, so I'm completely unqualified to write about fine dining experiences. Also, mainstream food and travel writing makes me gag. But I will say that I enjoyed my evening at Table by Ona. If you're a foodie, American or otherwise, who dreams of a 17-course tasting menu, by all means, go to ona.restaurant. Ona.restaurant is ONA.restaurant. You can have websites that sound like anything these days, so .restaurant is just like .com, only it's .restaurant. You know what I mean. Ona.restaurant, and reserve your spot. They're doing a couple of meals each week these days. You could also follow Jack K. Tonkin on Instagram, Tonkin, Tonkin, like the Gulf in Vietnam, I believe. Jack K. Tonkin. If you do go to Table by Ona, tell him I sent you. That's about all I've got for today. I used to write restaurant reviews for Lonely Planet, and it was completely soul-crushing. The space limit was 60 words. I think it actually had to be between 55 and 65 words. So you have to do a lot of editing to make something exactly that long. Also, just the tone of typical food writing is super obnoxious, in my humble opinion. So I don't do much of it. If you would like to hear more about Spanish cuisine, head by episode 30 of this podcast. That is called Spanish Cuisine, a love story. Over there, I talk about how I went from being a vegetarian to enjoying all of the high protein and high cholesterol aspects of Spanish food culture. That's an article that I think turned out pretty well. Episode 30, or it's on the blog, expatmadrid.com. If you're looking to learn some Spanish, you may know that I have a YouTube channel, Learn Spanish with Daniel. I have a couple of new Spanish videos up there from the last couple of weeks. I did one about the expression me suena, in the sense of me suena tu cara, your face. Seems familiar, for example, we could say. I also did one about the ñ, the letter ñ, which is in España, for example. It's a popular letter around here. I did a vocabulary episode where a lot of the words, I explain a lot of words using the letter ñ somewhere in them. There are even a couple of words that begin with ñ, if you're interested in that. Only a couple. Anyway, that is Learn Spanish with Daniel over on YouTube. You could also listen to the podcast on YouTube. All of the episodes are up there on Learn Spanish with Daniel, or just Google Spain to Go YouTube or something like that. You'll find it. I am on every podcast platform as far as I know. I am on podcast platforms that I don't even know about, according to Google. So if you have the opportunity to give me a rating or a thumbs up or a review or something like that, please do. I appreciate it. You can support the podcast over at expatmadrid.com/donate, anywhere from €3 to however much you want to donate. I appreciate that as well. Thanks once again to Deb for her recent donation. And that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hasta la próxima. Bye.